Hello and welcome to a very special show, and this is coming in the build-up to the all-important budget speech that will be delivered by our Finance Minister Urmila Sitaraman on the 1st of February at 11 a.m. Now, this is something that will impact our lives directly, and therefore it's all the more important to understand all the concepts associated with the budget. There are lots of terms and terminologies that might be difficult for the layman to understand, but that's precisely what we are here for, to deconstruct and simplify the budget. And for that, who better than Mr. Jayant Sinha, who is joining us here in Times Now studio to speak to us, to simplify the budget for us. He's also the chairman of the Standing Committee on Finance. He's been a former Minister of State for...
से सबसे बड़ा रुपया और ये रुपया का समय है. This is why we are focusing our attention on the budget.
So let's dive straight into the brass tacks, Mr. Sinha. Let's start with something called the expenditure. This is pretty much what the government spends on a yearly basis, and this actually gives us a sense as to how well placed we actually are for future spendings based on the revenues that we also get. So just take our viewers through what the expenditure, the overall expenditure of the government actually is.
So this is the first and most important aspect of the budget to concentrate on. We need to understand where is it that the government is spending its money and what is the total expenditure that the government is incurring. Now, these numbers, Siddharth, are based on the government's budget estimates that were presented when the Honorable Finance Minister presented her budget last year. So this is based on what is called the BE, the budget estimates. Now, the total amount that the central government spends, and the central government is about 15.6% of total GDP. India's GDP is estimated to be 258 lakh crores or 258 trillion rupees. Out of that 258 trillion rupees, 39.45, so about 40 lakh crores is what the central government spends. The states cumulatively spend a little bit more than that, almost about 50 lakh crores. Okay. So together, the state and the center comprise a third of the entire economy, of 258 lakh crores. And that's this 39.45 lakh crores. Now, let's figure out where the bulk of this money is spent.
Going. Yes.
The first thing you have to understand is that the biggest expenditure that the government has is 9.41 lakh crores for the interest expense on our debt. So the central government runs a deficit, which we will see soon. But because we run a deficit, we have to borrow to be able to manage this expenditure, and we have to pay interest on those borrowings, and that's the single largest item in the government spending, and that's 9.41 lakh crores. Defense, as it should be, given that we are in a hostile neighborhood, defense is a very large item, 3.85, almost 4 lakh crores. Education is 1 lakh crores. Then we have various subsidies. Yes. We have some transfer to the states, and then there are a variety of other expenditures. All of that adds up to this 39.45 lakh crores of expenditure incurred by the center.
So this is the outgo on the part of the center each year. Let's in fact also take stock of what the revenues are of the government to actually see what kind of fiscal legroom the government of India has. So these are, of course, this is an entire breakdown of the overall revenues of the government of India. Yes, Mr. Sinha.
Yes. So what you need to understand is that the government has three sources of revenue. So when we incur expenditure, we have to have revenues that will pay for those expenditures. And there are three major sources. One, of course, is direct taxes. So income taxes. So the middle class is always concerned, कि मैं कितना tax दे रहा हूँ. That amounts to 7 lakh crores. Taxes that companies pay is about the same, 7.2 lakh crores. And then we have various indirect taxes. And the most important one here, of course, is GST. So GST accounts for 7.8 lakh crores. That's growing very strongly. It's very robust. And we have fuel taxes. When you go and pay at the petrol pump, you obviously pay fuel taxes for both petrol and diesel, and that amounts to 3.35 lakh crores. So these are some of the major sources. Then there is another set of revenues that we get, which are non-tax receipts, of which some of it is disinvestment. For example, when we sold a piece of LIC in the share market, we got some revenues from that. And then there are dividends. So Reserve Bank of India, all the various public sector banks, ONGC, BPCL, all very, very good, Siddharth, I can see. You're absolutely correct. The government spends almost 40 lakh crores. The government's revenues, the government's income is 23 lakh crores. So we are running a deficit of 17 lakh crores. Now this is very important for everybody to understand, because think of your own household, think of your own business. In your own business, or if in your own household you were spending 40 rupees and earning only 23 rupees and incurring a deficit, a loss of 17 rupees a year, it would be very difficult for you to keep things going. And that is the first and most important thing you have to understand of the government's expenditures and budgets, that we incur a very large fiscal deficit, and that's what we have to manage year after year.
Hit upon an important point. Let's in fact dive straight into what the fiscal deficit numbers actually look like. In fact, at the start of every budget, and this is almost a custom, the finance minister makes it a point to actually inform the parliament that this is the amount of fiscal deficit, or the percentage of fiscal deficit that we're likely to reach. So if you can actually explain to our viewers what the fiscal deficit actually is, and if you can just take us through the numbers, because in 2020, which was of course a COVID year, the government actually had to spend a lot of money to address some of the grievances of the people and the sufferings in terms of finances that they actually had to experience. And therefore the fiscal deficit went up to 9.5% of the GDP, which is among perhaps an all-time high. And now of course it's come down to an estimated 6.4. So what do these numbers actually mean, sir?
So let's go back to the number that I draw your attention to.
Yes.
And that 0.4% number comes from, right? That is the fiscal deficit as a percent of GDP. Now you can see that has varied over time. At 6.4%, we are still at a very elevated level when it comes to the fiscal deficit. Of course, as you correctly pointed out, the high number was 9.5%. Yeah. And it was 9.5% because two things happened during the once-in-a-century COVID pandemic that we had. The first thing that happened was that our tax revenues and our income came down dramatically because there was less economic activity. Second thing that happened was our expenditure shot up.
Okay.
We had to do a lot. Remember, we paid for 220 crore vaccines, which was a miracle in and of itself.
Yes.
But that had to be paid for. We ran the very, very successful, very important Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, through which 80 crore people were getting free food every month. That, of course, also cost us a lot of money. And that's why you can see here is when the pandemic actually started, about this year, fiscal 2019 onwards. And then what happened was we ran these very large fiscal deficits. But as the pandemic is coming down, we have obviously started to reduce the fiscal deficit. And the expectation is that we will bring the fiscal deficit down systematically and come back again to the benchmark.
Correct.
And the benchmark, the number that everybody thinks is a good, stable number, a number that we should be working towards, that's 3% of GDP. So if you see there, we were close to 3% of GDP. We've been running 3% of GDP. And again, as I said, because of the pandemic, that shot up.
Of course.
And of course, now we want to get back to 3% of GDP. That is a good, stable number for us to be at when it comes to the fiscal deficit.
And that is expected to happen over time. In fact, a very prominent part of the expenditure budget are subsidies, and that's what we'll come to next. Let's in fact put that on screen. So this is the overall subsidy bill that the Government of India incurs on a year-on-year basis. We are tracking this from 2018 to 2022. Like you rightly said, one of the reasons why the fiscal deficit shot up to 9.5% of the GDP was because the subsidy expenditure was 7.06 lakh crores. That's now come down to 5.32. What can we expect in terms of how these numbers might pan out in the future?
That's right. Remember, as I pointed out, the government's expenditure is about 40 lakh crores. Now, of that 40 lakh crores, 5.32 lakh crores is subsidies. So it's a very substantial sum. It's larger than our defense budget. Remember, I said defense was 3.85 lakh crores. So for our entire army, our entire Air Force, Navy, military, everybody, we are spending 3.85 lakh crores. But on subsidies alone, we are spending 5.32 lakh crores. And that started in 2018. It went up a little bit because we started the Pradhan Mantri Kisan Samman Nidhi, which is a fantastic program where we've been able to identify, as the Honorable President said today, 11 crore farmers. So 11 crore farmers were identified. We started to put 6,000 rupees in 2,000 rupee installments for them. So they're getting 6,000 rupees a month. In the Pradhan Mantri Kisan Samman Nidhi alone, over the last few years since 2019, we have spent almost 2 lakh crores.
Okay.
So that's a very substantial subsidy. That, of course, was compounded by the fact, as I said, that we ran into the once-in-a-century COVID pandemic, which meant Garib Kalyan Yojana, which meant the money that we provided in Jan Dhan, which meant that fertilizer subsidy went up and so on. All of that resulted in this big spike that we're seeing of 7.06 lakh crores. That started to come down in 21, and of course as oil prices also started to come down, and now of course has been elevated a little bit because of oil prices again, right? Because oil prices have gone up because of the Ukraine war, which is why 4.46 to 5.32 lakh crores. Remember that the major subsidies are food, Garib Kalyan Yojana, fertilizer, which is linked to the price of oil, which is why this has gone up, and of course fuel as well. So food, fertilizer and fuel, these are the 3 main subsidies. Then we have the Kisan Samman Nidhi as well. That's what accounts for all of our subsidies, and you can see that it's been up and down a little bit.
So therefore you talked about oil prices, you talk about food inflation as well. That gives us an opportunity to segue into our next indicator, and that is inflation. Where do we stand right now, Mr. Jayant Sinha, in terms of inflationary health, so to speak? There was an alarming situation, at least some of the experts basically said that the months of April and September were particularly hard, but we do see a stabilization since then, where the inflation rates have actually dropped to 5.72. What does this all mean, and how can we now expect the budget to bring this number under control?
So inflation is a tax on everyone. Right? So inflation is a tax because prices go up and your income doesn't catch up. So inflation is something that we all worry about. महंगाई गाने वाने भी उसमें निकले हैं, आपको मालूम है. तो महंगाई के बारे में सब लोग चर्चा करते हैं. Now one thing you should note about this chart as opposed to the previous charts, just so you keep things in mind, that this is done on a calendar basis.
Correct.
Quarterly basis. Those were done on an annual basis. This is quarterly calendar numbers, so it's quarter to quarter.
Yeah.
Now here you have to note 2 things as you look at this. Number one, we had the COVID pandemic, and during the COVID pandemic we had a supply shock. Okay, so many global supply chains for like semiconductors, electronic components of various kinds, various different durables like refrigerators and TVs and so on. Because of lockdowns around the world, those supply chains didn't work very well, and there was a supply shock, and which is why inflation started to go up a little bit, which is why it went to about 6%.
Correct.
But then something very important happened, Siddharth. What happened was in February,
there was a war in Ukraine.
The war in Ukraine happened.
Yes.
And when the war in Ukraine happened, oil prices shot up, fertilizer prices shot up, food prices shot up. So along with the supply shock that we got in COVID, we got a second shock, and that was the commodity price shock. Okay. These commodity prices went up. That's why you see this 7.79%. Then, and again, very, very wise and a very, very intelligent move that we made, which is that we started to get more cheaper oil, some of it from Russian sources.
Yes.
We were able to bring down our oil prices. We were able to take down fuel and excise taxes to ensure that prices at the petrol pump were not too high. We started to bring things back under control, and we have been able to, as a result of that, because it takes some time for it all to filter through, we've been able to bring inflation down. Now, one important thing about inflation you should know is that the RBI is mandated to keep inflation at less than 6%.
That's the
It's
benchmark.
the job of the RBI to keep inflation at less than 6%. We were in fine shape because we had gotten through the supply shock of COVID in January. We were at 6%. Then, of course, Ukraine happened, the war happened, we got the commodity price shock, and that's why inflation started to go up. That forced RBI to raise rates. As you know, RBI has been raising rates as well. The repo rate has been brought up. In total, the repo rate has been brought up by 225 basis points, that is 2.25%. All of that has been happening this year. So as RBI has been raising its rates, EMI has gone up, but it has also brought inflation down. Inflation is at 5.72% and coming down. So this is what's been happening with inflation. So yes, India's economy, like that of economies all around the world, is affected by what happens globally. But we've done a far superior job of managing inflation, Siddharth, than other economies have. I will tell you that other major economies like the US, like Europe, like Japan, all of them have been experiencing inflation at levels that they haven't seen in 40 years. Their inflation is at 9 or 10%.
Okay.
These are unheard of rates for slow-growing, developed economies. But yet, our inflation has been at 5.72%. Once again, full marks. Kudos to RBI and the government for managing inflation so well.
And another area, not just inflation, where we are a global bright spot, and we're coming to that next, is in terms of our GDP growth and the recovery that we've actually managed to make post the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is the big number that Mr. Sinha, a lot of people look out for at the start of every budget session. So yes, we've suffered a serious blip, a contraction of 6.5% in 2020-2021, but it's now projected to grow at 6.9%, and a further projection that's been made in the economic survey is that we'll hit a real GDP growth of 6.5%, a nominal GDP growth of 11%. Please explain the distinction between these two to our viewers, sir.
Very good questions. And remember, I mentioned to you that GDP is 258 lakh crores, which is 258 trillion rupees, which is about 3.2, 3.3 trillion dollars. That's our GDP. That makes us fifth in the world in terms of GDP at 3.2, 3.3 trillion dollars. There are only 4 other countries that are ahead of us in terms of GDP. You have the US at about 21 trillion dollars. You have China at 18 trillion dollars. Then you have Japan and Germany, which are both about 5 trillion dollars,
okay,
right? So we are at 3.2, 3.3 trillion dollars, depending on where exchange rates are. We have Germany and Japan both at about 4 to 5 trillion dollars. We have the US at 2021, and then we have China at 18 trillion. So these are the economies that are ahead of us. But at the rate that we are growing, we will get to 5 trillion and surpass Germany and Japan by 26, 27. Somewhere in that time frame, given how fast we are growing, we are likely to surpass those 2 economies as well. But that growth rate of that economy is what this chart shows, and again, this is back to annual numbers, not quarterly numbers, which we were seeing earlier.
Absolutely.
So you're seeing 3.6%. That was already the impact of COVID coming in. Remember, COVID started in January 2020, so you're seeing that impact right there with the 3.6% number. Then the collapse because of COVID, once in a century, unprecedented, not seen in independent India, this kind of situation, but a global collapse, and we suffered from it as well. The recovery was very strong. 8.7%, followed by now 6.9% this year. So strong recovery. We expected to do 7% this year. That's approximately what people are saying. And then next year we'll be at 6.5% is what the economic survey is saying. Now, very important point. When we say 6.5%, you say, well, it's come down from 6.9%. But please remember that what is happening right now is that the world is likely to go into recessionary conditions. And India is impacted by what is happening around the world. They are expecting a recession in the United States. They're expecting a recession in Europe. China is growing slower than it has in the last 30 or 40 years. So when the world economy is slowing down so dramatically, it is going to impact India, which is why it's likely that we will go from 6.9% to probably 6.5% is the economic survey saying. But that's still a decline of only 0.4%, decline of only 0.4%, when the rest of the world is declining by 2 or 3%. So even here you can see, because of the excellent policies that we followed, we are buffered, we are cushioned from what's happening in the world.
Mr. Sinha, the government launched something very important towards the end of 2020-2021, and that was the Gati Shakti initiative. That actually ties in with what we want to talk about in terms of capital expenditure, which is our next slide, where obviously there's a synergy now that's been planned between 16 different ministries in terms of infrastructure in India. What everybody looks out for when it comes to the budget is how much money is actually being pumped into infrastructure so that more jobs are generated. So therefore, take us through this all-important figure of capital expenditure, which is of course a very significant part of the expenditure budget of the government as well.
No, you're exactly right. Remember, we said that the total expenditure is about 40 lakh crores. Remember, we started with that number of 40 lakh crores, 39.45 to be precise. Of that 39.45 lakh crores, what is very, very exciting and very important for our future is that 7.5 lakh crores is going into capital expenditure. And what economists tell us, and what is in fact been the history of economic growth, is that when you invest, you're really setting the stage for the future. Investment drives growth, and so we have to invest more and more in our economy, because it's very simple, Siddharth. It's like building factories. It's like investing in equipment like aircraft or locomotives or big trucks. It's building offices, it's building hotels, it's building apartments, flats. All of that is capital expenditure. That is money invested in the economy. And this 7.5 lakh crores is not money that's only used for this year. If I build a factory, that factory is going to last 30 years. If I build a power plant, that power plant is going to last 30 years. If I build an airport, that airport is going to last 50 years. That's the engine that powers the economy, which is capital expenditure. The government has significantly stepped up capital expenditure of 7.5 lakh crores. Yes. The states are also spending quite a bit on capital expenditure right now. And what's equally important, because remember, and I mentioned this right up front, the government is a third of the total economy, right? 258 lakh crores, again, $3.2 trillion. A third of that is center plus state plus local governments. 2/3 is the private sector. So when the government spends, when the government builds excellent infrastructure, the roads, the railways, the highways, the ports, when the government puts all of that in place, the states put all of that in place, then the private sector is motivated to invest as well. They invest and growth really, really takes off. And that is the best kind of growth, because investment-driven growth is growth that makes us more productive, that drives job creation as well.
Final point now. Of course, everyone talks about Berozgari. It's been a big political hot potato as well. But let's in fact take us viewers through the numbers. Now, this does not capture the entire picture, because we've just showed them the urban unemployment, which has actually been on a decline. Once again, April-June 2021, Mr. Sinha was again in the peak of the COVID crisis. And it's actually come down now to 7.6%. This is in urban areas. So just tell us as to what the budget will actually aspire to do in terms of ensuring that unemployment does not remain a cause for concerns.
Siddharth, again, this is a chart that is on a quarterly basis. It's not on an annual basis. So this is once again a quarterly chart, but it's a very important chart because it shows you the impact of COVID. April-June 2021, if you remember, Siddharth, that was the peak of the Delta wave.
Yes.
That was the peak of the Delta wave. Urban unemployment shot up, but and again, this is the good news. As I said, we had the sharp V-shaped recovery. Even though GDP had gone down by -6.5%, it recovered by 8.7%. And you're beginning to see that impact in terms of unemployment, urban unemployment. And here you can see urban unemployment has steadily come down. It's now at 7.6%. And of course, the trend is very, very important, because what it's showing is it's dramatically declining unemployment. And we expect that to continue as well, particularly because of three very important factors, Siddharth. Three very important factors, which is why, as you said, जो हर कोई बेरोजगारी के बारे में कहता है और नौकरी की तलाश करता है, उसके लिए जो मैं तीन आपको बात बता रहा हूँ, उनके लिए बहुत ही सकारात्मक ये खबर होगी. Very positive news for them. What is the positive news? There are three reasons why we think unemployment is headed down further, and there will be lots of high quality jobs that are going to be created. The first is the point that we were discussing earlier, which is capital investment by the government. So capital investment by the government has been very, very strong. You can see that it has gone up to 7.5 lakh crores. As a percent of GDP, it's gone up. The states are also spending, and of course, private sector is also spending. That CapEx drives a lot of job creation, and that's very, very important because of all the roads, the highways, the ports that are being built. The second important point is what is being driven through the government's industrial policy in 14 sectors of the economy through the production-linked incentives. Okay. The production-linked incentives are lakhs of crores of subsidies that have been made available so that we can build a world-class, world-leading manufacturing base for India. Today, the Honorable President spoke about the fact that smartphones were not manufactured in India. And today, not only are we producing 20 crore smartphones in India, the world's biggest smartphone factory is in Greater Noida, and we're exporting smartphones around the world. That has happened because of the PLI schemes, and that has happened because the government has picked those 14 industries that are going to really position us very well for the future and create lots of high quality jobs.
The third?
And the third factor that I will talk about is export markets. Because of what the government has been doing in terms of strengthening our competitiveness, improving the quality of our infrastructure, improving the ease of doing business, slashing red tape, slashing obsolete laws, we are becoming a much better exporting nation. And we've seen that in our export revenues because our exports have been growing steadily and strongly. And that also is a major job creator. So number one, capital expenditure by the government. Number two, production-linked incentives for the industries of the future. Number three, our exports. All three of them are very, very well positioned, and that should create lots of good, high quality jobs going forward.
That's the finest lesson anyone can possibly deliver on the budget. It explains a lot of concepts. So we'll, of course, now have to look forward to the Finance Minister's speech at 11 a.m. on the 1st of February. But thank you so much, Mr. Jayant Sinha, for your time. That was very insightful indeed. And we'll, of course, be in touch with you in the build-up to the budget as well. And we'll pick Mr. Sinha's brains after the budget too. So stay tuned, and thank you very much for joining us on this very special show.